Chapter 13. As Ambler followed Fenton into the conference center, the man's entire frame seemed to be vibrating with anticipation. The hall of the Palais was a several-story atrium of mitred glass above hexagonal granite tile, and the lobby and 3 balconies overhead were bathed in the dull silver glow of the winter sky. A sign, charmingly the old-fashioned kind of building directory, white letters laboriously affixed onto the slotted black plastic, indicated which spaces had been allocated for the various meetings. "Any moment now," Fenton murmured. "You're going to see proof of what our operation can do." From the adjoining hall, Ambler heard the rustle and rumble of rejoined conversation, the sound of a meeting that was breaking up. People were standing up, chairs were moved slightly, some attendees rushing forward to introduce or reintroduce themselves to others. Some went for coffee or headed outside for a smoke. "What time do you make it, Tarquin?" 11:59, a beat. 12 noon. Abruptly, loud shrieks echoed through the granite and glass atrium. The conversational rumble ceased at once, replaced by a tattoo of terror. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." The screams and keenings swelled. Fenton stood by a carpeted staircase, an arm hooked around Ambler's shoulders. Black-jacketed security guards started to hustle in, paramedics a few minutes later. Somebody at the meeting had been killed. Controlling his emotions, Ambler turned to Fenton. "What just went down?" Fenton spoke briefly into his cell phone, then nodded. "The dead guy's name was Kurt Solinger," he told Ambler in a low voice, "a Brussels-based European trade negotiator. And according to our intel, he was a real menace. Guy fell in with some Bader-Meinhof remnants when he was in grad school. Started living a double life after that. An economist of the first water, and an incredibly engaging fellow, everybody would tell you. Meanwhile, he was exploiting his EU position to set up IBC's international business companies around the world, laundering money from rogue nations and diverting significant sums to hand-picked terrorist cells. They called him the Paymaster, and what he paid for was bombings and especially assassinations. But why would you? Today's a special day. Did you know that? Fenton's eyes were hard. An anniversary of sorts. Do you recall when the U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary was murdered? Ambler nodded slowly. Several years ago at a Grand Sao Paulo hotel, the Deputy Treasury Secretary, once the youngest tenured member of the Harvard Economics Department, and the architect behind 2 Latin American currency bailouts, had been gunned down before a crowd. He had been among the brightest lights in the American government, yet the assassin had never been apprehended. Though authorities suspected the involvement of anti-globalization extremists, an extensive international investigation had gone nowhere. It happened exactly 5 years ago today, at exactly 12 noon, in a hotel ballroom, in public. His killers were hirelings who prided themselves on their ability to time it with precision, and to carry out the deed brazenly. Kurt Solinger was the paymaster, working through former affiliates of the Rote Army Fraction. He paid for the hit. We learned this not long ago. Not the kind of evidence you can use in court, you understand, but the real deal. Jesus Christ, Ambler breathed. Exactly 5 years ago today at 12 noon. Trust me, the message won't be lost on those bastards. We've just sent a signal on the radio frequency. They'll know they've been rumbled, and they'll panic. They'll disperse and try to regroup later. Existing operations will be disrupted. Their existing network of contacts will come under suspicion, and their own paranoia will do them more damage than we'd be able to. Those shrieks, those screams, exactly the same soundtrack as in Sao Paulo. Poetic fucking justice. Fenton lit up a cigarette. Ambler swallowed hard. That Fenton was simply hanging around an assassination that he had orchestrated struck him as close to showing off. Fenton anticipated his thoughts. You're wondering why I'm here? Because I can be. His gaze was unwavering. We don't run scared at SSG. I need to impress that on you. Our work may be clandestine, but we're not fucking outlaws. We are the law. No doubt that was Fenton's way. The industrialist knew that nobody would ever trace him to the lethal incident just yards away. But we've got a much bigger fish for you. Fenton handed him a sheet of paper, an oddly filmy sheet, like a cross between onion skin and old-style thermofax paper. The scent told Ambler that it was highly combustible security paper, designed to be consumed by flame within a matter of seconds. Or shark, I should really say. This is the guy you want me to take out. Ambler's stomach churned, but he fought to keep his voice even. Ariadne's thread, find where it leads. Fenton nodded gravely. Ambler read the sheet quickly. The target's name was Benoit Deschesnes. Ambler knew the name. The Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. A very big deal indeed. Other occupational and residential details were provided, along with the description of his daily habits. What's the situation with this guy? Ambler asked, struggling to sound casual. Deschesnes used to work on nuclear weaponry for the French government. Now he's been taking advantage of his position as head of the IAEA to transfer nuclear expertise to countries like Iran, Syria, Libya, Algeria, even Sudan. Maybe he thinks a level playing field is only fair. Maybe he wants to make himself a fortune. Doesn't matter. Point is, he's dirty, he's dangerous, and he's got to go. Fenton took another puff on the cigarette. You've absorbed what's on the data sheet? Ambler nodded. Fenton took the sheet back and touched it with the tip of his cigarette. For a brief moment, the sheet blossomed into pink-white flame. It was like a magician conjuring a rose into his palm. And then it all vanished. Ambler looked around. Nobody had noticed. Remember Tarquin, we're the good guys, Fenton said. The cold made his breath visible. You believe me, don't you? I believe you, Ambler answered smoothly. Trust me, this is going to be the start of something very special. You take care of Benoit, and you'll be the equivalent of a made man. Then we'll talk. Then you go to the head of the class. Ambler closed his eyes for a moment. His predicament was exquisite. He could alert the government about Deschesnes, but what would be the point? Government officials were the ones who had, quote-unquote, outsourced the task to Fenton in the first place. Besides, his words would carry no credibility. His former bosses believed that Tarquin was insane, and there was no evidence that Harrison Ambler had ever lived. His enemies would not have gone to all the trouble of inducing a psychotic episode like that if they hadn't intended to use it. The recording of Ambler's paranoid ravings would surely have been screened to key members of the intelligence community. Then, too, if Ambler passed on the assignment, Fenton would find somebody else for it. Suddenly, a police officer strode toward them. You, sir! The thick-necked uniformed man barked at Fenton. Me? You! The policeman came over with an affronted look. You think you're above the law? That what you think? Fenton looked like a picture of innocence. I'm sorry? The policeman put his face close to Fenton's and curled his lip. There's no smoking in the conference center. No smoking in any municipal building by city statute. Don't act like you didn't know. There are signs everywhere. Ambler turned to Fenton, shaking his head. Man, you are so busted. A few minutes later, the two walked outside along a cleared bluestone path in front of the conference center. Snow lay heavily on the ground, frosting rows of boxy shrubs to either side of the bluestone. "So have we got a deal?" Fenton asked. It was madness. There was no sense, no logic in his joining an enterprise whose basic legitimacy he rejected. Yet to refuse would be like dropping the thread, and that was one thing he could not do, not while he remained in the labyrinth. To lose the thread was to lose himself. "You'll pay me in knowledge, showrunner," Ambler heard himself say. Fenton nodded. "It's the usual story, isn't it? Somebody messed with you. You want me to find out who, find out why. Like that, right?" "There's nothing usual about this story," Ambler almost replied. "Like that," Ambler said softly. The skies had grown darker. It was now the sort of definitive, conclusive gray that made it impossible to think that the sky had ever been or could ever be any other hue. "With your skill set, you should have no trouble," Fenton said steadfastly. "And if you do, if you're captured, well, you're the man who wasn't there, aren't you? You officially don't exist. Nobody will be the wiser." "Sounds like a good deal," Ambler said leadenly, "unless you are the man who wasn't there." Langley, Virginia. Clay Caston was looking disapprovingly at the oatmeal carpeting in the ADDI's office. There was a coffee stain a few feet from the tan leather sofa. It had been there on his last visit. He suspected it would be there on his next visit. Caleb Norris had no doubt ceased to see it. Many things were like that. One failed to see them not because they were hidden, but because one was accustomed to them. "I think I'm following you so far," Norris was saying. "You find the patient's intake date, and then you do a variance analysis." "Right, a variance analysis. You're looking at subtle patterns in expenditures, like a fiduciary plume around the event." "Good thinking." An expectant pause. "So what did you find?" "Nothing." "Nothing," Norris repeated, downcast. "Oh well." "Which I found pretty fascinating." Norris gave him an uncertain look. "It's like the dog that didn't bark, Cal. A special, low-level operation means a lot of paperwork for authorization and all sorts of special requisitions, even if it's a few dollars from petty cash. If a junior-grade staffer does anything that involves agency resources, he's filling out requisition forms. Spores in the forest, a trail. The higher up you go, the less there is of that, because you've already got the resources at your command. What I'm trying to tell you, Cal, is that the absence of any irregularities at all suggests the presence of a high-level mover. Nobody drives up to Parrish Island and checks himself in. You're bundled in by men in white coats. That means the redeployment of vehicles, the possibility of overtime, and on and on. But when I went looking for the reverb, I couldn't find anything." "How high do you think?" "At least an E-17 level," Caston said. "Someone your rank or higher." "That should narrow things down." "Oh, did the government suddenly shrink while I was at the men's room?" "Humph. Reminds me of the way you nabbed that guy from the Directorate of Operations who'd made that secret trip to Algeria. Used a fake passport and everything, covered his tracks perfectly. So far as we knew, he'd spent the week in the Adirondacks. I love the thing that tipped you off. Abnormal rate of toilet paper usage in the men's room outside his office." "Please, it wasn't exactly subtle. He was going through a full roll every day." "Traveler's diarrhea, you figured. Giardiasis, an intestinal bug endemic in Algiers, you said." "We got a confession 2 days later." "God, you were on a roll." The hirsute administrator chuckled to himself. "But what about the career coverage? Learn anything more about the escape artist?" "A thing or two," Caston said. Because I'm thinking we gotta figure out a way to lure him in, make approaches. That won't be so easy, Keston said. We're dealing with an unusual customer. I'll tell you one detail I found suggestive. Seems that in the field, nobody would play cards with the guy. He cheated? Caleb Norris unknotted his tie but left it in place, in the manner of a tabloid newspaper editor. Tendrils of black hair curled over his unbuttoned collar. Kasten shook his head. You know the German word Menschenkenner? Norris squinted. A person knower? Someone who knows a lot of people? Not exactly. A Menschenkenner is someone with a knack for figuring people out, for taking their measure. He can read people then, like a book. You wouldn't want to get near this guy when you've got something to hide. A walking lie detector. I'd like to get me some of that. The people I spoke to doubt Tarquin himself knows how he does it, but no surprise, they've done research in the area. And Norris plopped himself down on the sofa. There are a lot of variables at play, but the research indicates that people like Tarquin are particularly attuned to things like micro-expressions, facial expressions that last no more than 30 milliseconds, the kind of subtleties most of us would never notice. Specialists talk about leakage and emblems. Seems there are all kinds of ways that hidden emotion spills out. In terms of the human face, there's lots of information that we simply tune out. Probably we couldn't get through the day otherwise. You've lost me, Clay. Norris put his legs up on a battered coffee table. Kasten guessed that it was not battered when the Department of Office Supplies and Services delivered it. Everything in Norris's office looked a little more shop-worn and scuffed than mere age would account for. Again, this is all stuff I've just found out. Apparently, though, various psychologists have been making a study of this. You videotape someone speaking, then you slow it down, go through it frame by frame, and sometimes you see another expression that's at odds with what's being said. The subject's looking mournful, then for a fleeting instant, they look triumphant. But it's so fast that we mostly aren't aware of it. There's nothing mystical about what he does. It's just that he's responding to things that are so fleeting that on most of us they don't register. So he sees more, but what does he see? It's an interesting question. People who study faces have worked out certain combinations of muscles that are involved in squelched emotions. Someone starts to smile and immediately forces down the corners of their mouth. But when you're doing that consciously, you're going to move your chin muscle too. When the corners of your mouth are pulled down involuntarily because of sincere feeling, the chin muscle doesn't change. Or if you're putting on a fake smile, there are certain muscles in the forehead that don't change the way they should. Then there are involuntary muscles in the eyebrow and eyelid that convey anger or surprise. Unless you're a method actor, unless you're genuinely experiencing these emotions, there are going to be subtle muscular discrepancies when you're simulating. In most cases, we don't see them. They're too subtle for us. There are hundreds of ways in which the facial muscles can interact, and it's like we're looking at a rich canvas, but we're colorblind. We see in shades of gray, whereas a guy like Tarquin sees all the colors. Makes him a damn formidable weapon. Norris's heavy eyebrows became a pair of circumflexes. He wasn't pleased with what he was learning. No question, Kasten said. He did not voice a suspicion that was still inchoate in his mind, that there was a connection between Tarquin's uncanny gifts and his hospitalization, indeed the erasure of his civilian existence. Kasten hadn't worked out the logic yet, but the day was young. For 20 years he was working for us. That's right. And now we've got to assume he's working against us. Norris shook his head hard, as if erasing some internal etch-a-sketch. This isn't a man you want to have on the other side. Whatever side that is, Caston said grimly.